After the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there was a kind of disconcertingly quiet period where the attention of the Russian intelligence agencies seemed to be fully absorbed with the war in Ukraine. And what we seem to be seeing now is that they are freeing up spare capacity. Their tactics are shifting, and there is much more activity on every kind of element of the spectrum directed towards NATO member states in Europe.
This week, we are taking a closer look at a piece that the Times published about Russia's espionage operation across Europe. And I'm delighted to be joined by the Times Berlin correspondent Oliver Moody. Oliver, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
What were the sort of the main and maybe the most concerning things that you found in your research and your investigation?
Well, my section of the investigation was really looking at NATO's eastern flank. And what this is really about is the kind of military logistics corridor that's going from Germany through Poland to the Baltic states, which would be the absolutely crucial artery for the defense of NATO if there were to be a war with Russia. And what we've basically seen is three things that have been new over the past year or so. The first is that there has been a huge uptick in the general volume of every kind of Russian interference, ranging from cyber attacks on German political parties to GPS jamming over the southern Baltic and the jamming of satellite transmissions to Russian agents scoping out German and Polish infrastructure and military bases with a possible view to how they could be sabotaged, to minor incidents of sabotage, to a couple of apparent assassination plans. The next thing that we've seen is that the Russian intelligence officers who'd previously been operating under diplomatic cover in the capitals of these countries have largely been expelled. My analysis suggests that the Germans, for example, have pretty much cleaned out the entire Russian military intelligence unit that was in their embassy in Berlin. There only seems to be one operative left. And as a result, the Russian security services have changed their tactics. They're now tending to recruit locals on an industrial scale to carry out what often look like quite petty acts of disruption, things like firebombings or graffiti. And the third change that we've noticed is the very obviously military character of these activities. There are suggestions by some analysts that this is almost a kind of preliminary shaping phase where Russia is testing not only how we respond to these kind of incidents, but also the potential for a much broader campaign of sabotage in preparation for a direct conflict with NATO if things were to get there.
Well, let's go back to what you said at the start and NATO's eastern flank, I think, as you put it. As part of the piece, it says that Poland is the country now not only a nexus of motorways and railways leading to the eastern flank, but it's also the chief conduit for supplies of Western military aid to Ukraine. So therefore, how significant is Russia's operation in Poland with regard to these sorts of behaviours that you've articulated?
It's very significant. First of all, in the immediate context of the war in Ukraine, Russia is very clearly looking for ways that it might be able to disrupt the supply lines that run through Poland. And one recent case, there was a Polish citizen called Janusz K. His surname hasn't been fully released by the Polish authorities, but he was suspected of casing out Rzeszów airport on the Ukrainian border, which is a really big logistics hub for all of these arms deliveries coming into Ukraine, with a possible view to setting up a plot to assassinate President Zelensky when he came through the airport a few months ago. But the broader context here is very much Poland's growing role, not only as a frontline state, but as one of the absolute central nexuses of NATO's operations and preparations to defend itself.
As well as that, there is the EU element. There is resistance, as the article describes, led by Germany and Austria within the EU. Can you go into that a little bit and talk to us about the sort of almost the political dimension in all of this as well?
This is a proposal from the Czech Republic quite recently to essentially make it impossible for Russian diplomats who may or may not be working for the Russian security services to travel around the Schengen zone. And Germany is among the countries that are very skeptical of this idea, in part because it's very sort of instinctively cautious and attached to the maintenance of diplomatic relations. It wants to have channels through which it can communicate with Moscow, and above all, because it doesn't want to take any steps that could be perceived as in some way escalating the conflict with Russia and thereby heightening the likelihood of a direct war.
You mentioned a couple of things at the start of the interview, three sort of key things. We tackled the first. Let's look at the other two. Can you go into a little bit more detail, some of the sort of complex operations around NATO as a whole, not just the Poland issue, but NATO as a whole, and how Germany is such a key part of how NATO is responding to this espionage operation?
Absolutely. So the context here is that under NATO's defense plans, if there was a very serious direct conflict between NATO and Russia, something like 300,000 Allied soldiers would have to be moved to the Baltic region. A lot of them are going to be coming in from the US on ships into German and Dutch ports, and then these hundreds of thousands of troops with all of their armored vehicles and their kit are somehow going to have to be conveyed across to the Baltic states. And that means that there is just this huge mass of potential vulnerabilities for Russian attack: the railway lines, the roads, the other bits of critical infrastructure, even things like power plants or hospitals. And therefore, there is an enormous sense of concern in Germany, first of all, that it doesn't necessarily have the manpower to protect all of this infrastructure itself, but secondly, that it really needs to try and shut down any Russian attempts to lay the groundwork for that kind of sabotage.
So you've mentioned the number of sort of locals that Russia is now turning to carry out its espionage. Talk to us a little bit about why it's doing that, the advantages, I suppose, of doing that from Russia's perspective.
The advantage is that it doesn't expose Russian intelligence officers to detection themselves. They can operate at arm's length. There's a bit of plausible deniability, which helps to leave a kind of impression of confusion. They don't really care if they get caught. It doesn't matter if these guys are exposed. There's a very kind of industrial aspect to it, particularly, all of these young Russian Germans and Poles and Ukrainians and Belarusians in Poland who are being paid a pittance to go and daub anti-Ukrainian slogans on the motorway bridges or set fire to shopping centres. But I don't want to play down the significance of it overall. I mean, one of the biggest incidents we saw recently was where a group of Polish citizens were arrested for attempting to kill Alexei Navalny's chief of staff, Leonid Volkov, in Vilnius with a hammer. So some of this is very serious indeed.
And in terms of we've spoken already about the sort of the military element to what's going on, but in particular with regard to sort of signal jamming, because we've seen a couple of instances, quite important instances of Russia doing this, and I suppose the question is, well, if it continues and if the consequences are even greater than they have been already, then this could be another very, very significant part of the whole operation.
Right. So since shortly before Christmas, we've seen a absolutely huge increase in Russian jamming and spoofing of GPS signals across the southern Baltic, particularly in Finland, Estonia, northern Poland, and even northeastern Germany, where I am. And this is usually characterized as a kind of civilian operation because it's things like flight routes that get cancelled as a result. but it's fundamentally military. These are electronic warfare systems that have an extremely broad range of capabilities. There's one up in Murmansk in the Russian Arctic Circle that has a range of about 3,000 miles and can disrupt TV, radio, smartphone signals. There's another one that at a much shorter range can plant fake messages on as much as 6,000 handsets at a time. We've seen that used in Ukraine. And I've had some experience with this myself in that when I was coming home from a NATO base in Poland a few months back, I got a sudden alert after I left the base saying that it looked as though malware had been implanted on my phone, so I had to get it wiped. I don't know if that was a piece of Russian electronic warfare, but I think that uncertainty is actually part of the point.
And from your own personal experience that you just mentioned, and also your investigation for this article, is the impression that you are left with an operation that is more widespread than perhaps people have thought up until this point, or that it's kind of what we would have expected, and this is simply a slight uncovering of it?
No, so to an extent, these things have been going on in northeastern Europe for years. We saw massive cyber attacks from Russia on Estonia in 2007. We've seen various kind of provocative military exercises since 2009. We've even seen incidents of GPS jamming of Swedish flights and so on. What has changed is that after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there was a kind of disconcertingly quiet period where the attention of the Russian intelligence agencies seemed to be fully absorbed with the war in Ukraine. And what we seem to be seeing now is that they are freeing up spare capacity, their tactics are shifting, and there is much more activity on every kind of element of the spectrum directed towards NATO member states in Europe.
So, first question to you, Bruno, is where are you? Explain where you are.
I'm standing on Boulevard de Région, which is in the heart of Brussels, in the heart of diplomatic Brussels. Just down there, you can see it, is the American embassy. Just behind me here is Russia's permanent mission to the EU. Just behind the American embassy they're next door, literally next door. A couple of hundred yards down the road is the Belgian equivalent of 10 Downing Street. Almost right behind us, as a crow flies one block, is Britain's diplomatic residence to Belgium and the European Union. So this is the heart of the diplomatic quarter. This is the heart of Brussels, where Brussels rules Belgium and where the EU is based as well, just down the road there. And behind me, in that Russian permanent mission to the European Union, which does almost nothing now since the invasion of Ukraine, there's a diplomatic deep freeze, unsurprisingly. The man in charge in there, Kirill Logvinov, 49, his career foreign ministry diplomat, but has been identified by Western intelligence services, particularly the Belgians here, who keep a very close eye on what's going on in Brussels. He's been identified as a senior foreign intelligence officer for Russia. The Belgians would like to expel him. They wanted to expel him when they expelled other diplomats, when the EU expelled 600 diplomats in 2022. But they were stopped from doing so by the European Union because the accreditation for Logvinov in there and for his diplomats is with the EU, not with Belgium. So there's a problem here. In plain sight in Brussels is a Russian diplomatic building hosting a very senior Russian diplomat who is probably Europe's spy chief for clandestine and many say sabotage operations across Europe, here in plain sight in Brussels.
So everybody sort of seems to know then what's going on, who this person really is. Why can nothing be done about it?
Well, the reason is that the EU, the European Union, has a mission in Moscow. They are justifiably worried that if they expelled Logvinov from Belgium, then there would be tit-for-tat expulsions and possibly the closure of a mission there. There are also many European countries who are worried that their diplomats in Russia would be treated the same way as American and British diplomats are. American and British diplomats operating in Russia face very, very tight restrictions on where they can go, who they can meet. And other European countries are worried that would happen to them too if they took action against this Russian mission to the EU here. That's not all of the EU. 8 EU countries have written a letter, which was discussed also at NATO a couple of weeks ago, and they are demanding that Russian diplomats are restricted to the country that they are registered in. At the moment, Russian diplomats accredited to EU countries can travel anywhere in the EU's border-free Schengen zone. Now, that makes it very hard to keep a tab on any diplomats like Logvinov, who have been identified as possible clandestine diplomats, spies working undercover. Now, if you had those kinds of travel restrictions, if a Russian diplomat, say, working out of a mission here, who was suspected of being a spy, not a diplomat, was caught, say, in France or Germany, he'd be breaking the terms of his diplomatic accreditation and could be kicked out. And this is seen as a very, very important step. Countries such as the Czechia and Poland argue, and they have good intelligence services, that most Russian diplomats now working in Europe are engaged in clandestine activity.
If this guy is a spy, and everybody seems to think that he is, or even if he's strongly suspected of being a spy, how much spying can these people actually do if everybody thinks and knows that that's what they're up to anyway?
Well, they have freedom of movement. They have freedom of movement throughout the European Union. They're able to cultivate contacts in the Russian diaspora. They're able to cultivate any other contacts and run agents. Now, since the expulsion of 600 Russian diplomats in 2022, the role played by Logvinov is now thought to be even greater. So, yes, they are running agents. They are running networks. From here, and then there's not much that can be done. Diplomats are protected. I mean, famously, they don't pay their parking fines in London, for example. Diplomats have a protected status. That's why diplomatic cover is so important for spies of all stripes, in fact.
Yeah, so how common is it to use diplomats as spies? Certainly for Russia. I mean, is there evidence of them doing that elsewhere?
There's plenty of evidence of Russia running clandestine agents. There have been arrests, in fact, across Europe. 18 arrests in Poland last month, for example. In Britain, 2 men who were arrested for arson in London, attacking a Ukrainian company, were known to have been paid by Russia. Their point of contact was almost certainly a Russian working under diplomatic cover. Iran too has used diplomatic cover. An Iranian diplomat, Assadi, was swapped by the Belgians last year in return for a Belgian who was being held in jail in Iran, and he was caught here in Belgium on his way to Paris to plant a bomb. He had a bomb in his car, and he was working under diplomatic cover in Switzerland. So it's used by particularly rogue states who take advantage of the Vienna Convention that protects diplomats and embassies right across the world. They use that as cover to carry out what are called hybrid operations, clandestine, illegal operations involving sabotage, propaganda, building networks of influence.
There is precedent for Russia expelling diplomats from its country and accusing them of spying. Is there any evidence that the EU is doing the same thing in Moscow?
If there is spying being carried out under diplomatic cover by the West, it would most likely, almost certainly, be done via national embassies. I would be very, 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 very surprised if the EU's mission was involved in any way. The EU, probably just as well, the EU does not have that sort of apparatus. It can share and coordinate the intelligence of its member countries, but it doesn't actually run any of its own kit, if you like. It doesn't have an army, It doesn't have a secret service. It doesn't have an intelligence service. It doesn't have a police service, etc.
So what can then the EU do to confront this problem, seemingly, of having spies on its doorstep, in plain sight, operating with no real way of being able to stop them?
Well, as many EU countries would like them to do, and as I think NATO would like them to do, they could restrict the movement of diplomats. They could limit the movement of diplomats to the country in which they are accredited without letting them roam across dozens of European countries freely. That, I think, would be a big start. It would be a big start because if you caught diplomats outside of a territory where they were accredited for, you could then expel them. But I think most importantly, and if you talk to diplomats from countries in the Baltic states or elsewhere in Central or Eastern Europe, the European Union just needs to kind of get real about what is going on. There is a conflict in Ukraine. Russia is using diplomatic cover to sabotage, and we've seen events of sabotage in Europe. And yes, expelling people who are thought to be involved in that will have consequences. But the European Union needs to be ready for those consequences. Britain has faced those consequences in terms of restrictions on its diplomats. I think the EU needs to get ready to face that test, and that's certainly what a lot of countries, certainly the Poles, certainly the Lithuanians, would argue is absolutely necessary right now.
Well, first of all, Charles, just give us a sense, if you can, of, give us some examples of how Russia over the years has been targeting France with disinformation and with spying.
Russia for a long time has seen France as one of the most vulnerable countries in Western Europe, the NATO countries, because of its history, because it has had a lot of sympathies with Russia. It has had a very big communist party. And we saw it building up again when President Macron was just getting elected for the first time. They released all his campaign emails with a lot of fake emails mixed up on the night before the final round of the election. That was Macron saw that as a challenge, a very definite aggression by Russia. It's carried on and intensified. It's carried on through helping Marine Le Pen and the hard-right National Rally Party, which is, as you probably know, on the verge of perhaps not quite gaining power, but very close to it. Russia has been interfering left, right, and center, according to all the French state agencies monitoring these things. They've been carrying out cyber attacks on ministries, jamming up computers. They've also been deluging France, especially in the last 2 or 3 years since the Ukraine offensive, with a lot of fake news through social media and through spoof French media sites. So it's what the French officials see as total war, as total hybrid cyber war at the moment going on.
And it can even extend to seemingly quite trivial things. I mean, you mentioned in your piece about how last summer the invasion of bedbugs in Paris was trying to be amplified by Russian sources.
Yeah, the Russian technique is to fan up everything that's causing trouble in France, and the bedbugs was one of them. It was a silly season summer story, really, and largely invented by the French media, which was colossally amplified by the Russians, who played it into all their main media and back into French social media and around the world. The idea was to discredit France. They've been doing it over many issues, when there are strikes, when there are ethnic riots, as there were last year, when there were Israel, Palestine fighting, Hamas fighting. They have been putting graffiti around Paris, stenciled graffiti in a rather clumsy way, which the French secret police rather say is Russian organized. They've been doing all kinds of funny stunts. They laid 5 coffins by the Eiffel Tower. They're apparently East Europeans who were arrested by the French, laid 5 coffins claiming to be coffins of French soldiers in Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine has been a big stimulus for all of this. The coffins were full of plaster, and the police managed to get the men who'd done it, and it seems that they were paid by Moscow to do it.
I mean, that's an interesting point about Ukraine, because President Macron, particularly in recent months, has been very hawkish when it comes to Russia and floated the possibility of using NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. I mean, historically, Russia had a a lot of beef, I suppose you could say, with the UK because of its steadfast support of Ukraine. But now is France seen in a very similar light?
Yes, President Macron went from cold to hot over Ukraine. He started off as one of the strongest sympathizers, not quite sympathizer, but expressed understanding of Russia and what it was doing in Ukraine. And he turned to the absolute extreme. He went from dove to hawk. He's now, as you mentioned, talking about the possibility of putting NATO troops into Ukraine, although he says he was just saying that it was not ruled out. He laid himself open to a lot of criticism in Russia and in Western Europe because of that. And the Russians have played that up, fanned it up. That's what those coffins were about. The Russians, partly because of Ukraine, partly because, as I said, French vulnerabilities, political vulnerabilities, make France a very good target for Russian mischief.
How well prepared is France now? I mean, you mentioned that Russia has historically seen France as being kind of open to influence. Given France, I mean, you'd have thought is quite aware of the threat. There are elections happening at the moment. There's the Olympics this summer. How braced are the French authorities for this?
The authorities are quite braced. They have put extensive resources into tracking and following, and they come up great detail. There are tens of thousands of Russian sites at the moment transmitting fake French news into France at the moment, according to the French. But the French people are very skeptical, as always. I mean, historically, they are the Europe's biggest believers in conspiracy theory. Western Europe, of course, Russians are huge believers in conspiracy theory. Eastern Europeans are. And the Russians are making the most of this. 1 out of every 5 French people believe at least one popular conspiracy theory, according to recent polls. That can be chemtrails or no man ever walked on the moon, or COVID was started by George Soros. But that conspiracy theories take off very hard in France. Of course, they're doing pretty well at the moment with Marine Le Pen's party because that is conspiracy central. And
I mean, just to pick up on that, Charles, how close would you say the links are between the National Rally and Vladimir Putin?
They were quite close. Vladimir Putin organized financing for Marine Le Pen's election campaign in 2017. A Russian bank paid quite a few million euros to her. They've paid back these loans. Marine Le Pen has toned down her sympathies for Russia. Of course, she was received by Putin before the presidential election before last, in 2017. This has now turned into a bit of an embarrassment for her, but there's nothing to suggest that she's changed her views fundamentally on Russia being a pretty good place compared with, say, the United States, which the National Rally does not like.
And just finally, and on that point, does Russia see the success of the National Rally, whether they win a majority or not remains to be seen, but the relative success of the National Rally, do they see that as a vindication of their strategy when it comes to spying and misinformation?
Absolutely, without any doubt whatsoever. I mean, quietly, they're probably congratulating themselves a bit already on, not that they are the instigators of the success of the National Rally, but they have certainly tried to amplify it. I think a lot of experts here would suggest that their amplification has, to some extent, worked.
What is the latest on Italy in particular when it comes to this growing espionage operation that Russia is conducting across Europe?
Well, in contributing to this article, I focused on one particular incident, which is quite illuminating when it comes to understanding the extent of Russian penetration in Italy. And this was the case of a man called Artem Us, a Russian who was arrested in Italy. He was flying into Milan airport. He was arrested because the Americans were trying to extradite him on allegations of having used American technology to help the Russian war effort, sending American technology to Moscow to be used in the development of armaments. So the Italians, therefore, on a US request, picked him up, put him under house arrest. He actually owned a property near Milan. He was put under house arrest there. He was made to wear an electronic surveillance bracelet. none of which amounted to much when associates of Artem Us showed up one day, helped him snap off the bracelet, and before the police could show up to figure out what was going on, he had disappeared. And months on, this was last year, months on, it looks like he may have been helped out by a hired bunch of Serbians who'd come over through the Balkans and perhaps spirited him out that way. He later showed up in Russia triumphantly, having escaped from this house arrest in Italy. And this was very embarrassing for the Italians. But seems to show that the Russians really kind of know their way around Italy and can put together operations like this right under the noses of Italian police.
And there's also a link, isn't there, between Italy and the Salisbury attacks in the UK?
Well, I was told during the course of writing this piece that the Salisbury poisoners had flown through Rome's Fiumicino airport and Milan's Linate airport, suggesting that they were quite comfortable using Italy as a transit country.
Let's talk a little bit about Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. She was fooled by a prank call, as you write about in the piece, from two Russian comedians posing as African diplomats. Again, that's an instance that perhaps tells us more about the Russian espionage operation in Italy than perhaps might be obvious on the face of it. Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, it was pointed out to me that this had to be based on quite a carefully planned operation. The two comedians, if we are to assume they had help from spies, they will have had to have known how to get through to her and when she might be free to take that call. That's quite an alarming prospect if there are people out there operating on behalf of the Russians who know when the Italian Prime Minister is going to be free to take a call. It's quite worrying.
You mentioned at the start one instance involving Artem Us. There's another person that you mention in this article by the name of Walter Biot, who was caught in a Rome car park handing over secret documents to two Russian diplomats. Again, a lot of controversy around that, but also some significant conclusions and inferences to be drawn there.
Yeah, this was back in 2021, so before the invasion of Ukraine. Walter Biot was a Navy official, taking the classic envelope full of cash in return for handing over secret documents that he had access to. On the one hand, this was a big success for Italian counter-espionage in that they were able to track him, listen into what he was doing, and then catch him red-handed. On the other hand, you can flip that around and say that the Russians must have done a heck of a lot of work figuring out he was a guy they could target, so they must have therefore looked into quite a lot of possible recruits who had access to those kind of secrets before they decided that Biot was the right guy. You know, you can't just go around if you're a Russian spy and propose these deals to anyone who works for the Italian government, because otherwise you're going to get burned. So you need to find the right person, figure out they are going to be accepting your offer, and then move in. So it's quite a detailed build-up.
And was there a suggestion that this instance, and as you say, you know, the number of people they would have had to have assessed, perhaps ruled out before they approached Walter Biot, that revealed that the operation, Russia's operation in Italy, was perhaps bigger or more complex, more advanced than people had thought previously?
Absolutely. Hopefully no more, because a lot of the people I think involved in that recruitment were then expelled from Italy. But no telling whether their replacements are going to be coming in and ready to do exactly the same thing over again. I imagine that checks will have been beefed up since then, particularly following the invasion of Ukraine. But certainly the Russians won't have given up trying.
The war in Ukraine that you just mentioned has again sort of changed the game in Italy, as it has in many other countries. And you talk about disinformation in particular, and how Russia is trying to sow disinformation in a country where the political soil is perhaps slightly more fertile than it might be in one or two other countries.
Yeah, Italians have been often quite reluctant to back the war. So it's certainly different, I think, to the UK, and this is due to a number of reasons. One is because during the Cold War there was a very strong Communist Party in Italy, so sort of lingering sympathies. Secondly, a suspicion on the left goes back a long way of NATO. And I think bottom line is that many Italians are just suspicious of going to war. They think that deals should be done, compromises should be struck. And so that means that the idea that it's all or nothing in Ukraine, Russia should be kicked out from all parts of Ukraine. To many Italians who have bridled against the concept of all-out war in the past, they're thinking, no, really, we should be doing deals. So that, in a way, makes them vulnerable to Russian disinformation, to Russian propaganda. Certainly on social media, there have been instances of fake accounts. So you have Italian actors, apparently Roberto Benigni, the Oscar winner, and Sophia Loren popping up on social media saying we must end this war right now, all completely faked by the Russians. And yeah, certainly fertile terrain. But then there's also the case of Italian politicians who don't have to be faked because they're actually coming out and saying these things for real. People like Matteo Salvini, the leader of the hard-right League Party, who has long been an advocate for holding talks with the Russians, pulling out of this war, not sending arms to Ukraine. And he is someone whose voice is very much amplified by Russian media.
And finally, we are aware that countries spy on each other. And Russia, of course, has every reason at the moment in particular to be conducting as widespread an espionage operation as it possibly can in Europe. But from your personal perspective, when you investigated this and exactly what's going on in Italy, did you come away with an impression that this is more concerning than people generally think, or that this is what I would expect to be going on?
Well, it's perhaps what I would expect, but perhaps there are lots of other people out there who don't think about this a lot and who would be surprised by this, but particularly people here in Italy. But I think that if you're following these kind of things, it's as you say, it's espionage as usual.
So, Tom, if you can just start then simply by summarising your piece and kind of what is going on in Europe at the moment with Russian spies.
Right. Well, we wanted to look at the apparent resurgence in Russian spying activities across Europe. So you only really need to keep half an eye on the news to realise or to have seen that over the last 6 months to a year, there's been a number of very high-profile incidents which seem to be covered in Russian intelligence agents' fingerprints. So, for example, there was the shooting of a Russian defector named Kuzminov in Spain. There have been arms depots explosions. There was the beating of one of Navalny's aides in Vilnius. So all of these things clearly seem to point towards Russian involvement. And so we wanted to look at how Russia, which seemingly was kind of, I wouldn't say down and out, but it was in many ways quite discredited at the start of the war, because the preparations for the invasion, which were carried out by the FSB, which is Russia's internal security agency, which is also responsible for overseeing the former Soviet Union, had gone very badly wrong, because the expectation from the Kremlin would be that Kiev would fall within a matter of days, and Zelensky's government would be toppled, and obviously that didn't happen. So the FSB was underwent a bit of a purge. There were senior figures within that who were punished. Some were put under house arrest, some were put into jail. And so the feeling was that Russia's intelligence agencies, which had always had this sort of, dating back to the Soviet and even Tsarist periods, always had this slightly fearsome reputation. The feeling was perhaps that it was actually a paper tiger, in much the same way that people also thought of the Russian army following that botched invasion. So we wanted to look at, from 2022, from that moment of deep crisis and failure, to the present day, when it appears that spying activities have gone into overdrive.
Yeah, and we'll come to exactly what is going on now in just a moment. How, though, have Russia's intelligence services managed to turn the situation around from that point where they were in real trouble with the botched, as you say, invasion of Ukraine, to the situation that we have today?
Well, I think that it was certainly premature to rule out Russia's spying agency. The country is run by a former intelligence director in Vladimir Putin, and the role of the FSB and its partner agencies is outsized by comparison with other, certainly Western European nations. The role that they play within society is huge, and the FSB in particular has an enormous number of staff. So I think it was always, to an extent, going to come back. But I think what's been surprising is in some ways, the brazenness of their operations. And some analysts that I'd spoken to said that whereas in the past exposure was, something to be avoided, it's no longer necessarily the case that Russia fears above all else that its operations are exposed. And you asked about how they are coming back. Well, there's a lot of recruitment of foreign nationals going on now, which is partly through necessity because of the fact that Russian agents across Europe have been expelled from European capitals, those that are operating under diplomatic cover, but also it gives them a level of plausible deniability if a depot in Prague gets blown up and 5 Bulgarians get caught, then it's almost certainly going to have been ordered by the Kremlin or Russia. But the fact that it's 5 Bulgarians and not 5 Russian nationals that have been caught gives them a layer of deniability.
So explain then the state of play now. Just how far-reaching is Russia's intelligence spying network in Europe?
The difficulty is that they, as I said just now, they are increasingly recruiting people from outside the organisation. So it's kind of impossible to quantify how, or to measure the scope of their reach, because that they are increasingly hiring petty criminals who sometimes won't even, for the most part, in fact, won't even know that they're being recruited by a Russian intelligence officer. So they might receive a message over social media or Telegram offering them £500 to go and set fire to a particular building. And so, that certainly would count as their reach, but that isn't an FSB officer going and lighting the match. So it's in some way, I mean, it's something that's not entirely new, that the security services have worked with organised crime in the past, but I think this kind of employment of low-level criminality is something that is becoming more of a thing than it was previously.
And what does Russia say? How does it respond to allegations that it is doing this? I mean, we saw with the Salisbury poisonings, deny on the part of Russia, despite evidence that they were involved. So what do they say when confronted with accusations that they have these spying activities or clandestine operations taking place in Europe?
Well, they deny it, and even to an extent with the Salisbury poisoning, I think that was an example of them not only denying it but also kind of trolling, even in that it was so ludicrous, the interview the two suspected assassins gave, in which they discussed how they'd come to Salisbury and they'd heard about the repute of Salisbury Cathedral spire, and they were just two Russians on holiday together in Salisbury.
Very short holiday, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. And so that kind of thing, like, nobody is ever going to believe that, of course, but it's almost sort of a kind of game in some ways, I think, and thumbing their nose at the West with these sorts of trolling tactics.
Talk to me about Unit 29155. What is it and why is it growing?
Unit 29155 is a unit within the GRU, which is the GRU is Russia's military intelligence service, and it's kind of a mixture between the SAS and MI5 in this country. And Unit 29155 is the kind of the most active unit within the GRU for carrying out activities such as assassinations and political destabilization. So it's kind of at the sharp end of the GRU. And for a long time it wasn't known about, and it was only revealed, I think, about 5 years ago. But it's the number of operations that it's been in, you'd have certainly heard of. So, for example, they were thought to have been the two guys that were thought to have carried out the Salisbury attack were 29155 officers. In 2016, there was an attempted coup in Montenegro that was also thought to have been carried out by 29155 officers. So they are highly trained and highly effective, at least when they succeed. And it's thought to have, in around 2022, it's thought to have had about 500 officers, but Ukrainian intelligence sources believe that number has now grown significantly, around fourfold to about 2,000 now. So the fact that they are hiring at such a rate is both a corollary and a testament to the fact that that Russia is ramping up its overseas intelligence and destabilization operations.
The picture we have then is a growing picture of Russian operations on two fronts. One is your, I suppose, conventional spy, or people from Unit 29155, which is growing. What they're doing, we don't, of course, know, but we know that more people are doing it. And then we have operations whereby it would seem that Russia is paying proxies to destabilize European countries. What's the sort of cumulative effect of that? What impact is all of this likely to be having on the war with Ukraine?
I mean, the kind of ultimate strategy is to weaken the West. So, and that of course has a knock-on effect for Ukraine, because the West is allied to Ukraine, and without Western support, Ukraine wouldn't be able to continue its defense of its lands. But then going back through history, that's it's kind of been ever since the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution, destabilization of one's enemies has been a kind of a cornerstone of Russian foreign policy, which initially took the form of attempts to export the revolution abroad. So it's quite sort of deeply embedded within the psyche of the Kremlin, that in order to remain, in order to advance its position in the world, Russia needs to constantly be undertaking actions which will undermine undermine anti-Russian leadership within Europe, whilst also promoting politicians and parties that are sympathetic towards the Kremlin. And the effect of all that for Ukraine is that, as I said, that a weakened and disunited West is more likely to stop funding Ukrainian arms supplies than a united and strengthened West.
And what's the evidence, or is there any evidence that it's working?
I think the Kremlin would certainly be quite satisfied with how the last 2 years have gone in terms of the level of political division within Europe, the rise of the far right, but also the number of pro-Kremlin parties and politicians in countries like Moldova, Bulgaria, Slovakia. Even in this country, when you see Nigel Farage saying that that the war in Ukraine was partly down to NATO's expansion into the east. So, yeah, on that level, I think you could say that there have been some successes, whether that's down to GRU operations in European capitals. I couldn't say, but the effect, or the end point is certainly one that I don't think the Kremlin would be unhappy with.